I come to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gather my myrrh with my spice. I eat my honeycomb with my honey. I drink my wine with my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love.
Ho-ri-o, 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 ho. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are looking at the Song of Songs.
Yeah, it's a short text, but there's a lot going on in it.
It's a very interesting text. It's not the first religious text that we've done, but it is the first religious text we've done from traditions that are ours, so to speak, that we have a relationship with personally. But it's also a very odd religious text as well.
Mm-hmm. It's meant different things at different times for different communities.
Yeah. What would you say is the reason why somebody might want to read Song of Songs?
I think the first reason is I think it's very beautiful. It's got some incredibly beautiful poetic passages, and they look a bit different in the different translations that are available, but every one of them has pearls in it, right? And then beyond that, I think it's incredibly interesting text to read. It's a short text to understand how commentary works, like how reading communities over time have made a text their own in different ways at different times in different places. And this opens itself up to that.
That's all true. I think also for some readers who are less familiar with the Bible and the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible, it really shows the diversity of the texts that are in there. If you didn't grow up reading all of the Bible, let's say, you may have some ideas about what you'll find there that this text is probably not part of.
Yeah, so people who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, they might have an expectation that for the Christian Bible, they understand Gospels, they might know something about the letters, they might know about Revelation. For what Christians call the Old Testament, or others might call the Hebrew Bible, there's an expectation that there's the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books that are doing a certain kind of historical work and law-giving work. And they might know about Job, and they might know about some of the prophetic books and the Psalms, right? And then Song of Songs or Song of Solomon is kind of the Psalms' closest cousin in that it's also poetic, right? It's also poetry, but poetry of a very emotionally charged kind, and nothing else is like it, I think, anywhere else in the Bible.
No, I mean, this is very erotic poetry.
Totally. And you got to wonder, like, how does that work as scripture, right? And generation after generation has kind of unpacked that issue.
Yeah. Or fought against it sometimes, which is also interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was not, I was raised in an Episcopalian tradition. This was a text that, it's not like we didn't mention it ever, but it never came up.
Mm-hmm.
There was not really a Bible study component except for a catechism process. I don't remember it ever coming up in the readings and services or being mentioned in sermons or as a talking point when people talked about biblical stuff. So this book is something that I was aware of, but not familiar with until I, plunked down to finally read it as an adult.
Yeah, it's a book that has inhabited this really peculiar place in the landscape. So we might talk a little bit later about the ways in which Christian monastic communities manage this text. It generally was something that you weren't allowed to read until you were at a certain level of maturity. And so you could think about what was going on there, like who's ready to read this. And so that comparative neglect you're describing in your own experience may be not unrelated to that. I remember stumbling across it very accidentally because I think we've talked about this at other times. We might come back to it later. I was raised from ages 7 to 14 as a Jehovah's Witness. And one of the circumstances of that was that you had a lot of meeting times that you'd be attending and you weren't allowed to read other things or do other activities. You had to listen, but it was okay if you were reading your Bible. So I would a lot of times be just reading the Bible. And I remember stumbling across the Song of Songs and being like, what is this?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. I was quite young, right? But I was like, this is a different thing.
This is something. This is something else. Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let's get into some of the details about it.
Should we say a little bit about its origins and how it's shaped? It's not very long, but it's got almost a kind of narrative, or you can pick out a narrative to it.
Can you?
Well, you could kind of tell who's speaking at different moments, and then you can make a story for yourself that more or less captures it, but I think very more or less. I mean, you have to provide a lot as a reader to make a narrative out of it.
I think it also depends on what edition you're reading or what translation, because some of the editions mark out This is the man speaking, this is the woman speaking, this is the chorus of friends speaking at different points. And some, such as the main text that I was reading, the Jewish Publication Society's translation, don't indicate that at all, and just provide text with occasional dialogue, speech markers, quotation marks. And that leads to a very different kind of reading if you're not being guided by those markers. So yes, traditionally it is understood as two lovers or a lover and a beloved speaking to each other in turns with occasional interjections or eruptions from a group of friends. And it chunks out, so to speak, into different sections. There's a bit of an introduction, and then we get lovers talking, and then we get a scene of remembering a visit from a lover, and then we have sort of an address to other women from the woman, etc. There's about, I don't know, 10 or so of these different chunks. Some of them feel like they could be excerpted as individual poems, as separate poems, and they probably started out that way. It's I think, very unclear. You might know more about this than I do, but in terms of what the theories are, in terms of how this text came to look the way it is. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have a frame narrative. It doesn't explain to you, oh, this is, so-and-so came today and saw her beloved and said this, and then they said that. There's nothing like that. It is just the lyric poetry. It is just the expression of desire or the ramifications of desire.
Yeah, desire and estrangement, like sort of drawing together and pulling away. This is something that happens repeatedly throughout the chapters. And I don't know a whole lot about the earliest origins of the text. That's something that maybe we could learn more about in the future. I do know something, though, about the reception of it over time and how that changed. And I find that really endlessly interesting. You were talking before about the lack of a kind of frame narrative, or how some texts of it might offer you markers to tell you who's speaking. But most of them don't. They just sort of, you hear this voice and then you hear that voice. And the way you orient yourself is through this, I don't know what to call it, other than like sort of gender normativity, whether the speaker is addressing the person he will call my sister, my spouse, or whether it's the woman who's addressing what she calls my beloved. So that's the thing that orients you. The gender binary is what orients you. And this is something we could definitely talk about more. That's super interesting. But just to add a little bit more on the frame narrative question and the kind of signposting, the commentaries are the places that happens. So sometimes they'll do commentaries in a very, very allegorical kind of way. And we might talk about that, what that means. It's sort of a figurative explication of how you could understand this literal depiction of an erotic union, what that might mean in symbolic or figurative terms. But they'll also sometimes give you kind of a historical narrative. And that's the place that the other title of the Song of Songs enters in, the Song of Solomon. It's sometimes understood as a kind of poetic expression of the erotic union of King Solomon and Sheba. And the logic of that is partly related to the tradition that holds that the Psalms were written by King David, and the Song of Solomon is a poetic production that's associated with his son, King Solomon. So sometimes you get that kind of historical dimension, which is not exactly a frame narrative, but is I guess you would call it a historical background that is sometimes brought to bear.
Right. It's as if the lack of a frame narrative required readers to supply one.
Absolutely.
And this became part of the tradition. So it is read through this frame narrative that was put onto it thousands of years ago.
Exactly.
And the life of that text has lived with that frame narrative.
Exactly. And it really, like I said, opens itself up generation after generation. And one of the things I've been very curious about, but haven't chased down, is modern reception. That is, I know a little bit about the ways in which the Song of Songs continues to be received in devout communities, continues to be important as a devotional text, at least for Christian readers. I don't know about other kinds of responses or ways of manipulating the text or making the text one's own that might go in very different directions. That might be something we explore in the future.
Yeah, when I was reading the text this time, several of the phrases sounded very familiar, either because they are just widely known phrases that have, entered general vocabulary, or because I've heard them quoted and woven into the fabric of songs and novels and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a tremendous tradition of looking to this text for elevated and intense ways of expressing erotic desire or erotic love without necessarily wanting to incorporate all of the religious commentary tradition that's been going on with it.
Yeah, maybe this is a good moment to read a few lines just to give listeners a sense of the flavor of this text. And I think flavor is a probably really good word for it. I'm going to read the few opening lines that we started with and the continuation of them. I come to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gather my myrrh with my spice. I eat my honeycomb with my honey. I drink my wine with my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. I had put off my garment, how could I put it on again? I had bathed my feet, how could I soil them? My beloved thrust his hand into the opening, and my inmost being yearned for him. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh. Upon the handles of the bolt I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and was gone. It's pretty spicy.
It's so spicy. I don't know. It hit me differently this time, I guess. Maybe I'm just getting older or something. But while I sort of acknowledged when I read it when I was younger that there was something going on here, this time it was like, oh wow, this is very sensual writing. And more or less every translation that I read of it really captured some of that sensuality, and possibly because the materials it's working with are so, how shall I put it? The materials that it's working with are very concrete details. They're often very visual things. They're the fruit. They're the juices of the fruit. They're the smells of the perfumes. They're these things that can carry over across translation. It's not necessarily wordplay or cleverness in that sense that's causing it to happen. It's just these very strong, sensual in the sense of being of the senses imagery that makes up the bulk of this.
Tons of references to smells and tastes and all this, and it's a bit overwhelming. I mean, there's passages that are describing the bride, passages that are describing the bridegroom, right? That are just so luxurious. And I think like you, I read them and I'm like, make no mistake about what's going on there. As a young person reading it was bewildering.
Here's the section that I was looking at and that I've been having some thoughts about. Turn your eyes away from me, for they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes climbing up from the washing pool. All of them bear twins, and not one loses her young. Your brow behind your veil gleams like a pomegranate split open.
Because it's dizzying, right? Because you have to try to make sense of what's going on there.
Or you can let yourself just be overwhelmed by the intensity of the imagery. But I can imagine reading it as a young person, just not knowing what to do with that. Mm-hmm. What is it? Your hair is like a flock of goats? Like,
I know.
What?
I know.
And yet it somehow works. I can picture it, and the idea of these goats coming down, I guess, a hill, makes perfect sense as a sensual metaphor. I don't know. It sounds strange when I try to explain it, but when it is just that dense collection of words and images that have been put so simply and yet so thickly, it really works a treat.
Yeah. And they're like right on the edge of intelligibility and what you can sense and feel and imagine, and something you can't quite imagine. And so I'm just looking at a couple passages that are again, like the one you shared, holding us at that sort of point of suspension. And this is one from near the end of chapter 4. Your lips distill nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. The scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A garden locked, a fountain sealed. Your channel is an orchard of pomegranates with all the choicest fruits, henna with nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes. A garden fountain, a well of living water, and flowing streams from Lebanon. It's beautiful, right? But what does that mean? Your clothes smell like Lebanon, right? I mean, I remember reading this as a child and I was like, absolutely drawn in. I mean, always loved those lists, right? Absolutely drawn in, and you could smell it and taste it, but it's like, what is this world?
Well, Lebanon is known for its cedars, and some people like to put cedar chips in their drawers to keep their clothes smelling nice. No, I mean,
I guess what I mean is that a person that it's a person, but it's also a landscape. It's a whole world. I guess the idea that this beloved is your whole world, your whole experiential world. And as a really young person, I kind of could not quite fully imagine that. You know what I mean? You kind of glimpse that on the horizon, but you don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah. The poem is filled with interesting, specific locations. And some of them might be familiar to people who know the region, know that part of the Middle East. And some people, who have read the Bible might recognize some of these places from elsewhere. But I think just the overwhelming specificity of these places that, as you say, it's as if the whole world is resounding with the feelings that you're feeling. And every place you can imagine has a place in this description. I mean, it's Whitman-esque is what it is.
It is. I wasn't thinking about that, but you're absolutely right. I was thinking actually a little bit of Rumi in connection, especially with the cold open, this idea of like just inviting people in to love, to this experience that's wine and milk at once. But you're absolutely right that it's very Whitman-esque in some ways, that there's this microcosm, this very intimate world of you and me, and it's also the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, his big lists of places in America, for example, that he's exulting while he is appreciating the beauty of some young man. Like, it's very much the same kind of move.
Yeah. And I think you're putting your finger on what at least I find incredibly attractive about this text, and I think a lot of readers have. It's incredibly intimate and private. And also, it's got this thousands and thousands of years long history and been read as an important text within Jewish communities, within Christian communities in different ways over time. We might want to say a little bit about that, some of those different ways that it's been experienced communally and collectively as well as individually. Like it seems to be doing both of those things all the way through.
Well, before we move on to that, I guess, is there anything else that struck you this time as you were reading the text, just as you were tangoing with the text itself?
Well, one thing that's kind of funny is, it's a text that I have in the past spent a lot of time with because I was really interested in understanding how allegory works in general, that is figurative interpretation, over a fairly long period, from antiquity through, I guess, maybe like the 17th century or something. And so at that time, I had spent a lot of time with the Song of Songs and commentaries on the Song of Songs. So I first encountered it as a very young person in a, personal religious setting, but then encountered it a lot in a kind of academic setting. But a long time ago, it was like at least 20 years ago, right? So like more than like 25 years ago. So I was a little apprehensive. I was like, oh gosh, this is so long ago. I don't remember anything. And then I started looking at it. I'm like, oh yeah, this all comes back. This all comes back. So it was kind of like seeing an old friend again after a long time. You haven't seen each other for 20 years, but you're like, nothing has changed. That's what I feel like.
That's really interesting. I mean, so I'm interested in the fact that your reading of this, so to speak, today or this past week is really informed by your reading around it, right? The commentary and reception tradition of this text so strongly informs your relationship to it. Mm-hmm. And that's fair. And it's hard to get away from that, I imagine, just because, I mean, of course, this kind of text, a biblical text, is going to have such a strong tradition on it.
Yeah, this one in particular, though, I think more than, I'm trying to think of texts that have biblical texts with commentary. The only thing that I think has more commentary on it than this is probably Genesis.
Right. But Genesis offers more in a sense, in the sense of it gives you more hooks for understanding.
Well, it's like way longer, eh?
Yeah, and it's way longer and it's more narrative. Uh-huh. Like you can read Genesis and the commentary tradition is fascinating, but you can have a sense of it without that, perhaps.
Absolutely.
And this text, I was reading it without knowing the commentary tradition as much. I knew the very broad strokes of what the main allegory is, but I hadn't read a lot of the commentaries and so forth. And I was reading an edition that, like I said, didn't provide a lot of commentary along with it, didn't say this is who's speaking now, didn't try to chunk it up. In fact, it even obscured where the biblical chapter markings happen. It was there, like I could find that info, but it didn't say it loudly, so to speak. It did split up the verses, but it didn't split up chapters or show you the numbers too aggressively. And it was very interesting because it really encouraged me to get rid of all that in a sense. Like it doesn't read as a religious text if you're coming to it. I don't know. There's nothing in it that points to it the way that some other allegories that we've read have pointed to the fact that they are allegories. This points to its sensuality. It mentions Solomon a few times, but it also has got so many different voices going on, and it shifts so quickly from one type of writing to another and from one type of situation to another that it felt, as I was reading it, not so much like I was looking at two people talking to each other with occasional crowd scenes, chorus scenes, but rather as if it was sort of plucking erotic thoughts from all of humanity, so to speak, going over all these different voices, all these different experiences, these little shards of experience had been put together into a mosaic. It became a much more heterogeneous text than I think a lot of people have tried to make it into something that is, coherent and linear and narrative in a sense. And I was like, no, this is an explosion of everything.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting you say that, because you're sort of describing the commentaries as kind of controlling the text. And to some extent, that is what they do. But they are also unleashing that radical potentiality that you're describing as being there in the text. And I think one of the places we can see this most strongly is the way gender works. So if you're just looking at the text itself, there's a male voice and a female voice. And what's interesting, I mean, what I think is super interesting is that you have that gender normative binary there, but then when you get to the commentary tradition, especially in the 12th century, things get strange, things get queer, maybe even, because male writers invite their male readers to understand themselves as the bride and invite them to open themselves up in ways that are highly, like using highly erotically charged language. And in other cases, some of the commentators talk about the bride still in feminine terms as being understood as the Virgin Mary, but they're understanding a kind of erotic union that is at once the union of bride and bridegroom and mother and son. So that's, got a whole nother level of like, how do we make this intelligible in spiritual terms?
Right.
So that's what I mean by the commentary tradition opening up this potentiality. Like the text itself, like you were saying, and I totally agree with you, has this kind of porousness and uncertainty built into it. And then it's sort of tacked down to some extent by the attribution of the historical circumstances of Solomon and Sheba to it. And then it gets tacked down a little bit more with that gender binary that the language inscribes. But then the commentators are like, they blow this up completely.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Certainly.
Yeah, no. So it's kind of, it's built into the text. And it defies all these efforts, I think, to control it, which is really cool.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
So what did you like the text? If you did like it, what things about it did you like?
I did like the text, and I guess I've expressed a lot of the things that I liked about it already. I loved the imagery. I did love the diffuseness of it in the sense of not having a master narrative, of just being this erotic charge that lingers, right? That just moves and changes and gets thrown back and forth between various speakers, but isn't meant to culminate. It isn't orgasmic. It doesn't end. It's just there and keeps going. And I enjoyed that, I don't know, that teasing quality of the text in that sense.
Yeah, the closing is something I've always found really I found bewildering the first time I read the text, and as a very young person, right? And continue to find bewildering. Do you want to talk about the commentary tradition a little bit first, or do you want to talk about the ending first?
Let's talk about the ending first, because I agree the ending is strange and doesn't feel like it's ending, but it does introduce a few odd new notes to what's going on.
Yeah, we've gotten these kinds of, I don't know what to call them, anatomies of the body over and over again throughout the text. There's the one that we talked about earlier where the bride is described as a garden locked, a fountain sealed, and there's that kind of sensuous imagery. There's a description like that of the bridegroom also where, again, it's one of these descriptions that's sort of right at the edge of intelligibility, like you can smell and taste and imagine all the things that are being described, but then some of it pushes you beyond what you can imagine. My beloved is all radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is the finest gold. His locks are wavy, black as raven. His eyes are like doves beside springs of water, bathed in milk, fitly set. His cheeks are like beds of spices yielding fragrance. His lips are lilies distilling liquid myrrh. His arms are rounded gold set with jewels. His body is ivory work encrusted with sapphires. His legs are alabaster columns set upon bases of gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as the cedars. And again, it's a description that on the one hand is sensuous, but on the other hand, it's architectonic, right? It's an artwork
Yeah.
that's being described as much as flesh. And some of the other descriptions do this kind of thing as well. It's teasing in a way that the text as a whole also is. The individual descriptions also have that teasing quality.
You're right. And now that you've read that, I'm thinking about it. It strikes me that it's really interested in pushing in various directions as far as it can go, some of that description, right? It's going at what is so attractive about the lover in different ways, but it's going as far as it can in this direction and then as far as it can in another direction, if you see what I mean. So it is more interested in the quality of the image and how striking it is, perhaps more than its appropriateness for any imaginable subject. You're not adding up to a picture of a specific person here. You are just getting the intensity of the appreciation.
Yeah, it's doing something to you rather than helping you get somewhere cognitively. I think that's exactly right.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about how this text is structured.
Yeah, I think I can't think of anything I've ever read that does quite that the way this does. I agree with you. So this kind of suspension that we're talking about, this experience, is something that also I feel like happens at the end. As you said, where there's not a kind of ecstatic resolution. There's not a coming together of lover and beloved in some kind of complete or final way. There's these set of deferrals. And one that struck me really forcibly the first time I read this, and every time I read it again, I bump into it and I'm like, oh, I don't know what's going on there, is this passage that's in the last chapter. It's chapter 8, verse 8 and following. And I'm actually going to read it from the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, which is the version that's used in Jehovah's Witness community. So it's the place I encountered it. Initially, what we're hearing is the lover or beloved speaking, and then there's a kind of an interruption. We have a little sister that does not have any breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day that she will be spoken for? If she should be a wall, we shall build upon her a battlement of silver. But if she should be a door, we shall block her up with a cedar plank. I am a wall, and my breasts are like towers. In this case, I have become in his eyes like her that is finding peace. So is it...
Yep.
This voice of the brothers, right? We have a little sister who is immature, right? Sexually immature. She doesn't have any breasts. What shall we do on the day she'll be spoken for? And there's two possibilities. If she's a wall, we'll build silver upon her, right? A tower of silver. If she's a door, we'll block her up with a cedar plank. It's a promise and a threat, right?
I mean, I think it might be two threats.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and anyway, so I reading this, so like, as a child, right? Like a child, right?
Yeah.
As and I was shocked because I'd read the things that came before, and there's this luscious language, and I'm like, what is this? What is this? And getting then to the end, and I'm like, this is an incredibly dangerous place.
Right.
What do you make of that passage?
It's very strange. It is a sudden turn towards a kind of prescription, a kind of law giving, right? A kind of sense of this is how the girl should behave at this moment, and these are her options. And this is how I, the woman who's been speaking in this poem, did when I faced this moment. Mm-hmm. I am a wall, not one of those doors.
And yet all that language of erotic openness, right?
Yeah, it's still told with that intensity that the rest of the poem has, which is weird and fascinating. And I don't know. I don't know what it would be like if the rest of the law-giving sections of the Old Testament, if Leviticus were written in this language, what would that be like? Oh, dear.
Oh, that's kind of hard to imagine. One way to get at it is to think about the language of the sister. Like we hear the term sister used over and over and over again in this text. And it's my sister, my spouse. Most of the time, that is, the bridegroom is using this language to describe the relationship to the beloved that is intimate in a particular kind of way. And there's a lot that the commentators make out of that. They really go to town with that. But here, again, it's the language of sisters, but here it's, we have a little sister. And here it's about brotherly authority. That's almost a kind of paternal authority, like in the sense of the patriarchy kind of authority. And so the language of being a sister, which has been this kind of at the nexus of erotic union all the way through this, is suddenly a language instead in being used in a discourse of prohibition and control.
Yeah.
And anyway, I mean, that's a fancy way to put it. But like I said, reading it as a kid, I was like, oh my God, I was like startled.
The other side of it is trying to decide who is speaking that section. And if you're understanding the poem as a man, a woman, a chorus, all three of them are possibilities for speaking it in a sense. Well, the one version that I would looked at that did assign hypothetical speakers to that, assigned that to the chorus of friends, which would make it into a kind of, these are the community standards. You know, we have a young woman in our group, in our polis, and this is how we expect her to be. Like, she is completely abstracted in a sense, but this is part of the community standards that you're going to have to live up to. And the other one is that this is what the man, let's say, expects of the woman, of the beloved, that, you know, I have a little sister. This is what we have planned for her. And then she says, well, I made the right choice, therefore I am alluring. You know, so and I suppose you could also read it as the woman speaking, although that seems a little harder to parse out.
It's complicated, right? Because, I mean, if you're being asked to be a wall, you're asked to be a fountain sealed, you're asked to be closed off to erotic union, right?
Right.
But she is, in the sense that she's described as a garden locked, a fountain sealed, right? At chapter 4, verse 12. We read this passage a little earlier, right? And yet, you know, I opened to my beloved, my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh upon the handles of the bolts. I mean, I'm like, she's kind of closed and kind of not really. So I guess what I'm getting at is, like, there's this invitation to sensuous openness and yet a prohibition against it at the same time, which is really interesting.
Exactly. Even in that passage, you know, shortly after the I am a wall and my breasts are like towers, a few lines later, in what may be the same speech act, but it's very hard to tell. But my own vineyard is mine to give. 1,000 shekels are for you, Solomon, and 200 are for those who tend its fruit. It's like, wait, is that part of the same metaphor? Are we, because she's a wall, she now has a vineyard that she can choose to give out? And is she giving it to Solomon or to the others who are tending its fruit? It's very confusing and very complicated. And I find it more satisfying if I don't think about explaining it too hard.
Well, I mean, and again, the commentators absolutely are responding to this, you know, this simultaneous invitation and prohibition. So there's many different commentaries that get written on the Song of Songs, and probably one of the most famous is one that's written in the 12th century by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a Cistercian abbot monk who wrote a lot of different things. But one of the things he wrote was a cycle of 86 sermons on the Song of Songs. And so before that time, the Song of Songs is read as a kind of a contemplative text. There are commentaries on it, but it's within the Christian tradition kind of understood as something you read in a contemplative way when you're ready for it, when you're at a certain mature level. And Bernard is kind of not exactly making it public or bringing it into the open completely, but at least framing it as a sermon, as something that is shared across the Cistercian community, right? And has a lot of influence and a huge afterlife. He talks about how this works, how allegorical interpretation might work, and we might want to unpack that in a little bit more detail. But the aspect of it that I want to kind of like draw out now, which is really relevant to what we were describing, this simultaneous invitation and prohibition, is how he glosses the opening line, how he interprets the opening line, which is, "Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth." He first begins to unpack it in this way. He says, "Tell us, I beg, by whom, about whom, and to whom is said, 'Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth.' Why this sudden and abrupt beginning in the middle of a speech? For he breaks into words as if he had mentioned a speaker in the text to whom this speaker is replying, as she demands a kiss. Then again, if she asks for or demands a kiss from someone, why does she clearly and specifically say, 'with his mouth,' as if lovers were in the habit of kissing with anything but the mouth, or with mouths which are not their own? Yet she does not say, 'Let him kiss me with his mouth,' but more intimately, 'with the kiss of his mouth.' What a delightful way of putting it. We begin with a kiss, and the lovely face of Scripture attracts the reader and leads him on so that he delights to search into what lies hidden." And he goes on a little further to unpack the different possibilities of the kiss. He talks about the erotic nature of the kiss. "He of whom they speak, let him speak to me. Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. Let him not speak to me in them or through them, but let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth, whose gracious presence and eloquence of wonderful teaching causes a spring of living water to well up in me. His living and effective word is a kiss, not a meeting of lips, which can sometimes be deceptive, but a full infusion of joys, a revelation of secrets, a wonderful and inseparable mingling of the light from above. This is why I ask him, not any other angel or man, to kiss me with the kiss of his mouth." So, I mean, and there, you go through the sermons, the cycle of sermons, it goes from this kind of intellectual interpretation to this affective, passionate yearning for the kiss that's on the part of the speaker, right, Bernard? And then he talks about the erotic kiss of the Father and the Son. He's talking about theological matters, but through the language of the kiss. To push that on a little bit further, to bring it out to you, reader, saying this. He says, be of good courage. Know yourself to be the Father's daughter in the spirit of the Son. Know yourself to be the bride or sister of the Son, for you will find both these names given to her. The bridegroom says to her, come into my garden, my sister, my bride. She is a sister because she is of the one Father, a bride because she is in one spirit with him. For if carnal marriage makes two one flesh, why should not spiritual union make two one spirit? The Father lovingly calls her daughter to honor her, and nevertheless invites her as his own daughter-in-law to the sweet caresses of his Son. Hear, daughter, and see, and listen. See from whom this bride demands a kiss. So this life, I mean, it's bewildering, right? This family language gets folded out because the soul is understood to be feminine. Even if you're a male monk, right? Your soul is understood to be feminine. So in its relationship to Christ, you are the bride. But you're also the Father's daughter, and also, therefore, the daughter-in-law of the Father who invites you to the caresses of his Son. And that caress, that kiss, is described in a very sensuous way in the commentary as it is in the Song of Songs. So it's like, how can I put this? The interplay of prohibition and invitation in the commentaries becomes kind of supercharged.
Yeah. No, I'm looking at the text now. I haven't read it, but I had a chance to look at the first couple pages before we started recording, and I'm looking here now.
It's wild, isn't it?
It's very wild. All the more, therefore, do I pray that the intense longings of the men of old, their heartfelt expectation, may be enkindled in me by these words. Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. Many an upright man in those far-off times sensed within himself how profuse the graciousness that would be poured upon those lips, and the intense desire springing from that perception impelled him to utter, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth, hoping with every fiber of his being that he might not be deprived of a share in a pleasure so great.
Yeah. Right?
I mean,
I know. And these are people who are vowed to abstemious lives, right? Like not just abstaining from sexual union, but also from any kind of intimacy with others. In other words, like, I don't know, things that you might hug a friend or pat someone on the shoulder and any kinds of like these physical expressions. These are also not understood to be not appropriate. The luxurious foods, the pleasures of the body are understood to be something you have to keep completely under control. And yet they're recognized, right? And so the commentary in the Song of Songs is a place to just sort of plunge headlong into the pleasures of imagining all that because it's directed toward a spiritual end.
Of imagining that, of dilating on it, of thinking about it, and of recognizing how you still have that, even though you have devoted your life to abstaining from it, that it is still there, as they would say in a more profound way, perhaps. Yeah, that this incredibly horny poem is still absolutely part of your, virginal life, so to speak.
At the heart of it, even, because the desire and passion that human beings can only conceive of through the body because we're embodied, right, can be directed in certain ways. Right? And then they would frame it as not directed downward toward the flesh, but directed upward toward a kind of spiritual ecstasy that draws on the body, but directs it in sort of toward eternity rather than toward the everyday. It's wild. It's a wild, and it takes all kinds of forms in the commentary tradition. I mean, we talked about Bernard, who's the most famous commentator, I think, on the Song of Songs, maybe. But there are a bunch of them in the 12th century, and they too use highly erotic language, but they do it in a slightly different way. One of them, Alan of Lille, who's writing around the same time as Bernard, does a commentary on the Song of Songs, but he associates the bride with the Virgin Mary, so the mother of Jesus. And he also uses this language of the kiss to describe the union and the nature of that desire. So he starts out this way. He says, "The glorious virgin, hoping for the presence of the bridegroom, desiring the glorious conception announced by the angel, eagerly wishing for the divine incarnation, speaks thus, 'Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth.'" So he's kind of giving us a frame narrative for the Song of Songs, like the one you were mentioning we don't have. And he says what you have to do is you have to understand that first line as being prefaced by the Annunciation and incarnation. So the angel Gabriel coming to Mary to say, "You're going to have a child." And that's simultaneous. The word comes into her and she conceives Jesus, right? So he's saying that has sort of, in a sense, already happened before this Hebrew Bible book is ever written, in a kind of like jump backward in time.
I mean, sure, I guess you could read it that way.
Sure. No, but I mean, like, and it's still just as erotic, right? And so Alan also has this highly erotic language to talk about this spiritual kind of interpretation. And a contemporary of his, Rupert of Deutz, puts it this way. He says, in this, I have to read it because the language is so great. He says, "O blessed Mary, the floodwaters of joy, the force of love, the torrent of pleasure filled you totally, possessed you totally, intoxicated you completely, and you sensed what the eye has not seen, nor ear heard, and what has not entered the heart of man."
Oh my.
So this idea of like irrepressible fullness, that's described in terms of erotic union in the Song of Songs. Rupert is also like giving way to the power of that language, but inserting it into a particular theology.
Wow. Yeah.
I know, right? I mean, you read this and like whether you yourself participate in those faith commitments, it's just really striking, this ability to kind of turn the body and the desires of the body from realization of that pleasure in the everyday to realization of that pleasure, like I said, in this eternal framework.
Well, and it doesn't try to escape the sensuality and the eroticism of the original text, which is, I think, what is interesting. They're not trying to allegorize in order to write away those aspects of the text, but rather to think about them more fully in the context where they find that to be appropriate. Which is an interesting move.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's pretty great. And it's very short. Any reader can pick it up. You can find it online anywhere.
So have you ever taught this text in a classroom setting?
I have in a graduate class on allegory, where we were talking about allegoresis, so allegorical interpretation on a pre-existing text, right? So you might talk about that with regard to Virgil's Aeneid, or you could talk about that with regard to the Song of Songs, and there's a ton of that kind of stuff going on in the 12th century. So in that very sort of specialized graduate student class sense, I've done it. But I've taught other parts of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, in, as you know, in a literature survey class that we did together. And I've taught Genesis, Job, and Matthew and John, I think. I mean, I've done the Gospels, in other words. And that's a really interesting task because in the undergraduate classroom, you can teach Bible as literature, and there's a long history of doing that. I've also taught excerpts from the Quran in those classes. But you have to frame it in a particular kind of way, mindful that there'll be students in the class who will be approaching those texts from the perspective of faith community. So my experience, you kind of have to bracket it and make it really clear. What is it to read a text as scripture? What is it to read a text as literature? And how can we hold those apart in our conversation, even while many of us may relate to it in both those ways?
Yeah. I found when I was your teaching assistant in that class many years ago that it wasn't as much the students who were coming with a religious background needing to think about it as literature or having anxiety about treating it in a secular way. That wasn't so much the issue as the students who came in with a tremendous, so to speak, chip on their shoulder about religion, who, as we were doing Genesis, kept insisting on all sorts of readings of the text that weren't there.
Interesting.
That came out of, centuries of Christianity writ whole, but Genesis is very specific and very different of a text, just as this is a very different text if you read it, so to speak, on its own, even if you acknowledge the reception and critical history of it. Reading it as a text, as literature, a bit divorced from that or potentially divorced from that is going to lead to a very different text. It isn't going to be anything like the anxieties you might have about organized religion, let's say.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I totally agree with you. And, one of the things about reading, let's say Genesis, for example, alongside other works of ancient literature and then a literary history after that, is it lets you kind of place it in a conversation that goes on over a long period of time. So you could see, as it were, cousins, other ancient texts that are similar to, in some ways, Genesis, or are useful to compare to Genesis in some ways. But you can also look at later texts that are clearly calling back, are reworking something that they saw in Genesis or whatever. It's quite a different enterprise to do something that I've thought about doing, but never had the opportunity to do, to teach a course that was just really Bible as literature. So where you would have a chance to kind of lay out on the table, like so many cards, the variety, the wide spectrum of things you find in the Christian Bible, like the quote unquote Old Testament and New Testament. You were saying before how the Song of Songs kind of is a surprise, because it's so different from all the other things that you encounter in that compendious kind of text. And that's kind of neat to lay out. Some things are very historical. Some things are very poetic. Some things are prophetic with a kind of poetic quality to them. There's just a huge variety. Revelation, and other visionary texts are doing something different again.
Yeah. I took a class like that when I was finishing my undergrad.
Did you like it?
I did, and it was largely, become more familiar with the Bible, at least from my perspective. And it was interesting because, I definitely got to explore some parts of the Bible that I was a lot less familiar with, although we didn't do Song of Songs for some reason.
For some reason,
that professor may not have wanted to touch that hot potato in the classroom. But it was, and I also found that many of the students in that class did not come from religious backgrounds, and so there was a lot of, again, surprise at all sorts of things that they found or didn't find there. But I've never taken a class that more systematically explored these kinds of texts in terms of other literatures that resonate with them, or, that would have put Song of Song up with Rumi and Whitman, let's say. And I think that would be a very valuable way of approaching Bible as lit.
I totally agree. I think that would be such an interesting course. You'd have to kind of frame it in a good way, but you can imagine putting together a little cluster of texts that were either, I don't know if you want to call them erotic, but they're using the erotic to talk about a lot of other kinds of things. Remember, we discussed the symposium, and you could not talk about the symposium without unpacking what love is doing in that work. Rumi, as you said, Song of Songs. One of the ones we're going to read a little later on, Layla and Majnun, right? You definitely have to understand in terms of the power of love in the universe. And Boethius, which we're going to read too, right, is going to take us down that path.
And I could even see taking a less obvious turn and reading it alongside something like Times Square Red, Times Square Blue.
Yeah.
With its exploration, both personal and sociological, about the effects of sharing pleasure, of sharing erotic pleasure with others and in the community. So, it would be very interesting. And so we could probably talk even longer about this weird little text and this very pleasurable little text, but I think our time is running short and we need to prepare for our next lesson. What are we reading next?
We're reading, actually, a text I've known for a long time and I'm very fond of, Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. It's from the 5th century, which sounds really tedious. Latin word from the 5th century. I promise you it's incredibly exciting. Goes in a lot of different directions, and his own life and death make an incredible story. So definitely tune in next time for that one.
Excellent. All right. Well, in the meantime, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at The Spouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/67. And The Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at The Spouter-Inn.